Let me tell you something they buried so deep in the footnotes of history, you need a shovel and a flashlight just to find it. Saint Teresa of Avila, patron saint of Spain, doctor of the church, one of the most celebrated mystics in all of Catholic history. And she was a black woman, not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally, biologically, genealogically, a woman of African and Converso descent, walking around 16th century Castile with brown skin and curly hair, and a grandmother who knew exactly what it meant to survive in a world that wanted to erase you. That is not speculation. That is documented. That is real. And the church knew it the whole time. Born Teresa Sánchez de Cepeda Villa y Ahumada on March 28, 1515, in Villa, Spain, this woman came into the world carrying a secret that her family had been legally forced to hide. Her grandfather, Juan Sánchez de Toledo, was a converso, a Jewish man who converted to Christianity under the brutal pressure of the Spanish Inquisition. But here is what the textbooks leave out. Juan Sánchez was also a man of African lineage. The Iberian Peninsula had been a crossroads of African, Moorish, Jewish, and European blood for centuries before Teresa ever took her first breath. And her family tree reflected exactly that reality. When scholars and geneticists and historians actually sit down and trace the Cepeda family line, what they find is not the pure-blooded Spanish noblewoman the church painted onto every canvas. What they find is a woman who was mixed, melanated, and magnificent. Now let us talk about why this matters so much. Because Spain in 1515 was not a place where being anything other than limpieza de sangre, clean blood, was safe. The Inquisition was not just about religion. It was about race. It was about power. It was about who got to be fully human under the law. The concept of limpieza de sangre literally translated to the purity of blood, and it was used to exclude anyone with Jewish, Moorish, or African ancestry from holding public office, entering religious orders, or being recognized as legitimate members of Spanish society. Teresa's family had already been dragged before the Inquisition. Her grandfather, Juan Sánchez, was publicly humiliated, forced to wear the San Benito, a garment of shame, and parade through the streets of Toledo as punishment for allegedly reverting to Jewish practices. That happened in 1485. Teresa was born 30 years later, and her family was still running from that shadow. Her father, Alonso Sánchez de Cepeda, did what many Converso families did to survive. He bought a patent of nobility. He paid money to legally rewrite his family's history. He moved from Toledo to Villa to escape the scrutiny. He constructed a new identity on paper. But paper does not change what runs in your blood. Paper does not change what you see when you look in the mirror. And Teresa, growing up in that household, knew the truth. She lived inside the truth every single day. The question historians have been too timid to fully answer is this: what did Teresa look like? And the answer, when you actually look at the evidence, is that she looked like a woman of color. Contemporary descriptions of Teresa are fascinating when you read them without the lens of European whitewashing. People who knew her personally described her as having a dark complexion, dark curly hair, and features that were decidedly not the pale, blonde ideal of Castilian aristocracy. Her close friend and fellow mystic, Fray Juan de la Miseria, painted her portrait in 1576, a portrait she famously hated, and even in that painting, even with the limitations of 16th century portraiture, her skin reads darker than the European norm. Later artists whitened her. Later artists softened her features. Later artists did what European art has always done to black and brown saints. They erased them and replaced them with someone more palatable to white audiences. But the original descriptions do not lie. And let us talk about the church's own records, because this is where it gets really interesting. The Carmelite order, which Teresa will go on to reform and reshape entirely, had strict requirements about limpieza de sangre for entry. Women who wanted to enter religious life had to prove their blood was clean. Teresa entered the Monastery of the Incarnation in Avila in 1535. She was accepted, but the records surrounding her acceptance are notably thin in certain areas. Scholars like Tiffany Aguido and Jody Belinkoff, who have done serious archival work on Teresa's background, have noted the deliberate gaps and silences in the documentation around her family's racial and ethnic background. Those silences are not accidental. Silence in the archives of the Inquisition era is always intentional. Silence means someone was protecting something, and what they were protecting was the truth of who Teresa actually was. Now here is where the story gets even richer, because Teresa did not just survive in this world. She thrived. She built. She transformed. This woman, with all of that weight on her shoulders, with all of that inherited trauma and institutional hostility, went on to found 17 convents across Spain. 17, she walked across the Castilian plateau in her sandals and her rough brown habit, negotiating with bishops and dukes and the King of Spain himself. She argued with the Inquisition and won. She wrote 4 major works of spiritual literature that are still read and studied today: The Interior Castle, The Way of Perfection, The Book of Her Life, The Book of Foundations. These are not devotional pamphlets. These are sophisticated, philosophically rigorous explorations of the human soul's relationship with the divine. And she wrote them in a time when women were not supposed to be theologians, when women of her background were not supposed to be anything at all. Let us talk about her writing for a moment, because her writing tells you everything about who she was. Teresa wrote in a voice that was direct, personal, self-deprecating, in a way that was clearly strategic, and absolutely fearless when it came to the things she actually believed. She called herself a poor woman. She called herself ignorant. She used the language of feminine weakness as a shield, because she knew that a woman of her background, making the theological claims she was making, describing the vision she was describing, founding the institution she was founding, needed protective cover. The Inquisition was watching her. They investigated her multiple times. They questioned whether her mystical experiences were divine or demonic. They questioned her sincerity. They questioned her sanity. What they were really questioning underneath all of it was her right to exist in the space she had carved out for herself. And she kept going anyway. She kept writing. She kept founding. She kept praying. She kept arguing. When the Inquisitor General Gaspar de Quiroga summoned her to explain herself, she showed up. When church officials tried to shut down her reform movement, she went around them. When powerful men told her that a woman had no business reforming a religious order, she smiled and kept moving. This is not the behavior of a woman who was broken by the system. This is the behavior of a woman who understood the system completely and had decided to dismantle it from the inside. The discalced Carmelite reform, which Teresa launched in 1562 with the founding of the convent of St. Joseph in Avila, was radical in ways that go far beyond the removal of shoes. Discalced means unshod, and yes, the Reformed Carmelites wore sandals instead of shoes as a mark of poverty and simplicity, but the real radicalism was structural. Teresa was creating spaces where women could pursue serious contemplative and intellectual lives outside the control of male ecclesiastical authorities. She was creating communities governed by a new set of priorities: genuine poverty, genuine contemplation, genuine sisterhood. And she was doing it in the face of massive institutional resistance. The Chalced Carmelites, the unreformed branch of the order, fought her bitterly. They imprisoned her collaborator and co-reformer, John of the Cross. They tried to force Teresa herself to abandon her foundations. They failed. Now let us bring this back to the question of race, because some people want to say that Teresa's converso background is a separate issue from the question of her African heritage. It is not. The Iberian Peninsula in the 15th and 16th centuries was a place where Jewishness, Moorishness, and blackness overlapped and intersected in ways that European historiography has consistently refused to acknowledge. The Moors who occupied Spain for nearly 8 centuries were not a monolithic Arab population. They were North African Berbers, sub-Saharan Africans, Arabs, and mixed peoples of extraordinary diversity. The Jewish communities of Iberia, the Sephardic Jews, had lived alongside and intermarried with these populations for generations. By the time the Inquisition began its project of racial and religious purification, the bloodlines of Iberian families were thoroughly mixed in ways that defied any simple categorization. Teresa's family, the Sniches de Cepeda family, came from Toledo. Toledo was one of the great centers of Sephardic Jewish life in medieval Spain. It was also a city with a significant Moorish and African presence. When scholars like Henry Charles Leah documented the converso communities of Toledo in the late 19th century, and when later scholars like Benzion Netanyahu examined the same records in the 20th century, what they found was a community that was racially diverse in ways that the term converso alone does not capture. Teresa's grandfather, Juan Sanchez, was not simply a Jewish convert to Christianity. He was a man whose family had been living at the intersection of Jewish, Moorish, and African heritage for generations. And that heritage passed to his son Alonso, and from Alonso to Teresa. There is also the matter of Teresa's own spiritual language and the way it resonates with African and diasporic spiritual traditions. Her descriptions of mystical union, of the soul's journey through the interior castle, of the prayer of quiet and the prayer of union, have been analyzed by scholars of comparative religion, and what they find is striking. The emphasis on direct personal experience of the divine, the bypassing of institutional intermediaries, the insistence that God is accessible to every soul regardless of social status. These are not simply Catholic orthodoxies. These are ideas that resonate deeply with African spiritual philosophies, with the direct communion with the sacred that characterizes traditions from West Africa to the Caribbean to Brazil. This does not mean Teresa was secretly practicing an African religion. It means that her spiritual intuitions were shaped by who she was, by the full complexity of her heritage, in ways that conventional Catholic hagiography has never been willing to examine. When Pope Gregory XV canonized Teresa in 1622, 100 years after her birth, the church was engaged in a very deliberate act of construction. They were building a saint for a particular purpose. The Counter-Reformation needed heroes. It needed figures who could represent Catholic piety and mystical depth in the face of Protestant critique. Teresa was perfect for that role. But to make her perfect, they had to sand down the edges. They had to soften the complexity. They had to take a brown-skinned woman of mixed Jewish, Moorish, and African heritage who had spent her life fighting institutional racism and sexism and turn her into a serene white European mystic floating above the ground in religious ecstasy. The iconography did the rest. Painting after painting, sculpture after sculpture. Teresa rendered in marble whiteness, Teresa rendered in golden light, Teresa with European features and European skin, and no trace of the real woman who walked those dusty Castilian roads. But the real woman is still there. She is in the archives. She is in the records. She is in the descriptions written by people who actually knew her. She is in the gaps and silences that careful historians have been noting for decades. She is in her own writing, in the fierce intelligence and the strategic self-presentation and the absolute refusal to be diminished that radiates from every page she ever wrote. She is in the 17 convents she built with her own will and her own faith and her own relentless energy. She is in the discalced Carmelite communities that still exist today all over the world, including in Africa, including in communities of color, including among women who look far more like the real Teresa than any of the paintings do. Let us talk about what happened to the historical memory of Teresa's background, because this is a story about erasure, and it is a story that repeats itself over and over in the history of the Catholic Church and in the history of Western civilization. The process of whitening Teresa began almost immediately after her death in 1582. The first biographies written by men who had known her or who had access to people who had known her were already careful about certain things. They acknowledged her converso background, but framed it as a matter of religious history rather than racial identity. They acknowledged that her grandfather had appeared before the Inquisition, but they minimized it, contextualized it, moved past it quickly. What they did not do was sit with the full implications of what it meant to be Teresa of Avila in 16th century Spain, what it meant in the body, what it meant in the skin. By the 17th century, the whitening was essentially complete in the visual record. The great Baroque painters and sculptors who depicted Teresa, Bernini's famous Ecstasy of Saint Teresa in Rome, created in the 1640s, presented a woman who bore no resemblance to the historical Teresa in terms of racial identity. Bernini's Teresa is white, soft, swooning, and a very European kind of spiritual rapture. It is a beautiful work of art. It is also a lie. It is the lie that gets reproduced in every church, every textbook, every devotional image to this day. And most people who venerate Saint Teresa have no idea they are venerating a deliberately falsified image. Now, some people will push back on all of this. Some people will say that the evidence is circumstantial, that we cannot know for certain, that we are projecting contemporary racial categories onto a historical period when those categories did not exist in the same form. And to those people, here is the response. The Spanish Inquisition created the most elaborate racial categorization system in the history of the pre-modern world. Limpieza de sangre was a racial ideology. It was enforced with documentation, with investigations, with public humiliation, with legal exclusion. The people of 16th century Spain were absolutely obsessed with racial categorization in ways that were deadly serious. Teresa's family was caught in that system. They suffered under that system. They survived by navigating that system. To say that race did not exist in 16th century Spain is to erase the very machinery of oppression that shaped Teresa's entire life. And here is the other thing. The scholarship is not circumstantial. It is substantial. Jody Belenkoff's work on Teresa and Avila, Stefanis Aguido's archival research on the Cepeda family, Alison Weber's analysis of Teresa's rhetorical strategies as responses to her vulnerable social position, Gillian Algren's work on Teresa and the Inquisition. These are serious scholars doing serious work, and what they collectively demonstrate is a picture of Teresa as a woman navigating multiple layers of marginalization, as a woman, as a converso, as a person of mixed heritage, with extraordinary intelligence and extraordinary courage. The racial dimension of that story has been the slowest to be fully articulated in mainstream scholarship, partly because of the ongoing discomfort in Catholic circles with confronting the racial politics of the Church's own history. But the evidence is there. It has always been there. What does it mean for the world today that Saint Teresa was a black woman? It means that the history of Christian mysticism, which is usually told as a white European story, is actually a far more diverse and complex story. It means that the intellectual and spiritual traditions that Teresa founded and transmitted, traditions that have shaped Catholic spirituality for 500 years, have African and Jewish roots that have never been properly acknowledged. It means that the millions of black and brown Catholics around the world who venerate Teresa are, in a very real sense, venerating one of their own, a woman who looked like them, who survived what they survived, who built what they build, who refused to be erased, even when every institution around her was trying to erase her. It means that the Discalced Carmelites, those communities of contemplative women in their brown habits and their sandals, are carrying a legacy that is more radical and more diverse than most of them have ever been told. It means that when a black woman in Lagos or Rio de Janeiro or Detroit prays to Saint Teresa, she is not praying to a white European saint who is somehow graciously including her in a tradition that was never meant for her. She is praying to a woman who shared her blood, her struggle, her resilience, and her refusal to let the world define the limits of her soul. Teresa of Avila died on October 4th, 1582, in Alba de Tormes, Spain. She was 67 years old. She had spent the last 20 years of her life in almost constant motion, founding, arguing, writing, praying, fighting. She died in the arms of her sisters, in the convent she had built, surrounded by the community she had created. Her last words, according to those who were present, were words of gratitude. She was grateful to die as a daughter of the church. And that is both true and complicated, because the church she served had also been her oppressor. The institution she reformed had also tried to silence her. The tradition she enriched had also tried to erase her. That is the complexity of Teresa's life, and it is a complexity that resonates deeply with the experience of Black people in institutions that have simultaneously claimed them and marginalized them for centuries. She was declared a Doctor of the Church in 1970 by Pope Paul VI, the first woman ever to receive that title. It took nearly 400 years after her death for the Church to formally acknowledge what she had always been, one of the greatest theological minds in Christian history. And it will take a similar reckoning, long overdue, for the Church and for the world to acknowledge the other truth that has been buried just as long, that this doctor of the Church, this patron saint of Spain, this founder of 17 convents, this author of some of the most profound spiritual literature ever written, was a Black woman, a woman of African and Jewish and Moorish heritage, a brown-skinned daughter of Toledo who walked across the plains of Castile in her sandals and changed the world. Her name was Teresa, and it is time you knew her whole story.